God bless us all, everyone. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, and thank us all. And by all means, and God bless us all, everyone. Thank you, Tim. I'm talking to. We started. This is this is episode 56, the realm of ideas.
Okay.
The org. Oh, Puddle, hi. Glad to see you. Oh, okay. Anyway, this is episode. Merry Christmas, everyone. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. This is day 6, I think.
We're not
Yes.
Jewish.
No, and but we have Jewish friends.
Yeah.
Okay, episode 56, Maeterlinck's Organic Engineering, Key Observations from Organic Architecture. Okay, so we had our preview and we talked a little bit about our fantastic TV episode where we had our segment on open program with Dr. Bob Lee, which was fascinating. And as Roberto said, Bruce, why don't you just shut up and let Julie talk more? Which was funny. Anyway, so let's follow up on what we talked about. And in fact, some of the things I was thinking about have come to pass from something I was going to talk to Mr. Swack about this week. Anyway, as a result, based on some of the poems that he had sent us, I had kind of like found something that I was going to speak about. Now, the interesting thing about Maeterlinck is we talk about this idea about the realm of ideas, and we also talk about the confluence of art and science. And actually, one of the things that came up in our program when our conversation with Dr. Bob Lee was the fact that I stated that the principle behind art science complex is not that we're trying to conjoin art and science, but understand that in fact they already are, and that it's this idea of specialization or specialism or mechanization that basically has forced us to kind of move away from what I think historically was a pattern of what people would call natural philosophy. Anyway, so from, I'd say, the 18th century to the 20th century, and I think one of the things that the brilliant work of Maeterlinck has done is that he basically kind of does what I think a lot of great artists did, and was that they understood that the stories, the myths, the legends of the Bible and of the mythologies of the ancient people were things that kind of enhanced the stories and the speculations of many great artists, many great scientists as well. Anyway, as a result, we find that now, as is very clear when you think about this in relationship to now, what Julie does very brilliantly, and I'll read my introduction to Julie's book, Bezoar Thirst, is engage these stories, if they are, which we kind of see on the frontiers of science, very much in the way that you might have seen these myths or legends or stories that were given to us by what were the kind of like primary sources of imagination and creativity in the past. So anyway, what I want to do is kind of give an example of the character of Maeterlinck in terms of the fact that what he does is speak about scientific circumstance as a writer, not as a scientist, but in fact gives insight into the way in which we are to understand these things. So, and also kind of like this was medication I kind of gave to Julie when I gave her this book as a gift, because I felt it very much kind of talked about her very specific nature. Around her summit, Portrait of a Lady from Maeterlinck's The Double Garden, probably one of my most precious possessions. Around her summit, reason, the purest that can illuminate a being, keeps watch, but it displays only the grace and not the effort of light. We spoke about this on Wednesday. Nothing appeared to me colder than reason until I had seen it thus play around the brow of a young woman, like the lamp of the sanctuary in the hands of the laughing, innocent child. That, let me briefly stop here. That innocent, adventurous mind is embodied in Julie in supreme form. In the hands of a laughing, innocent child. The lamp leaves nothing in the shade, but the harshest of its rays does not pass the inner circle of life, whereas their smiles beautify all that they touch without. That's one paragraph, pretty much embodies the nature of how this individual writer and playwright speaks about the nature of organic architecture in his way, in terms of the life of the white ant, the life of the bee, and the rest of his kind of understanding of the natural world. Anyway, I want to quickly talk about a warning that I see in The Revolt of the Masses, which I was going to discuss this week with Mr. Spock. So it's from section 12 of The Revolt of the Masses, the barbarism of specialization. And there are 3 portions here that are very, very important. Okay, that's 1, that's 2. Okay. The civilization of the 19th century, I said, may be summed up in the 2 great dimensions, liberal democracy and the technicism. Let us take for the moment only the latter. Modern technicism, springing from the union between capitalism and experimental science. Not all technicism is scientific. This was a warning, right? He'll go on to, in this chapter, kind of be more specific. And he gives examples. Now, the second one is he talks about the fact that specialization commences precisely at a period which gives to civilized men the title encyclopedic. And he's referring to Diderot's encyclopedia and the attempt to understand a broad natural philosophical view of the entire world. The 19th century starts on its course under the direction of beings who lived encyclopedically. Through their production has already seen some tinge of specialism. In the following generation, the ballast is upset and specialism begins to dislodge integral culture from the individual scientist. When by the 1890s, a 3rd generation assumes intellectual command in Europe, we meet with a type of scientist unparalleled in history. He is one who, out of all that he has to be known in order to be a man of judgment, is only acquainted with one science, and even of that only knows the small corner in which he is an active investigator. He even proclaims it is a virtue that he takes no cognizance of what lies outside the narrow territory specially cultivated by himself, and gives the name of dilettante to any curiosity for the general scheme of knowledge. That's key. General scheme of knowledge. That's the piece that under the natural philosopher, right, was the game in which they conducted themselves. And then the final piece is the specialist knows very well his own tiny corner of the universe. He is radically ignorant of all the rest. So, with that said, we open up to this idea of what we spoke about in our TV segment, where we said that the idea is not that, like I said before, art and science are not separate. They are the same thing. As Whitehead talked about in The Century of Genius, very much the way in which Leonardo conducted himself in his observations were akin to the idea of the virtue and consequence of the inductive method. And that is something that we can see not simply just within, right, science, but also within any investigation that purports to be as is a speculist. And I'll read that piece later from the introduction to Bezoar Thirst, Julie's book. Mm-hmm. So, what's new in Julie?
I was on television.
Yes, you were, and
That's
you were brilliant.
What is new in Julie.
And we were both on television, but you were much more brilliant.
You just asked me.
Yes. What's new in Julie?
I was on television.
And how was that experience? I heard you were pretty amazing.
Well, thanks. I really found the experience marvelous. I, again, want to thank Dr. Bob Lee, WBLS host of the wonderful television show Open on the BronxNet Television Network, for having us, for inviting me and inviting us, and to Bob's wonderful producer, Stephen Powell, thank you and your team for just making me and Bruce, I can talk to you, feel very, very welcome. They even invited us back while we were still there, which is
It's exciting.
pretty
And we'll
ringing
definitely take them
endorsement.
up
And
on
we
it.
will,
I
of
think,
course,
yeah,
go back.
yeah.
It was just a
There was a lot to talk
wonderful
about.
experience, and we didn't even get to scratch the surface uh, of our concepts and our work with the metaphor and lots of other things. We just grazed the surface of a vast field.
Mm-hmm. And if I may,
Yes, you may.
let me just follow up.
Certainly may.
What separates the speculations of the scientist when they venture beyond the line of what is alleged to be known as posed a new formulation, and that of the writer who creates an image of a world beyond that which we believe to be our own? In my mind, very little, if anything, possibly nothing at all. I see these actions as simply two views of the very same thing. When the one individual crosses that line, we believe to know with the conjecture, one is in fact proposing a new world, one that will be altered and shaped as a result of this new direction. As for the other individual, that they have anticipated the conjectures, even though they may not have expressed them specifically. That must by necessity take place in order for the world they anticipate to be as they see it. These two actions are inseparable, symbiotic. What differs is the point of view. The conjecture of speculation proposes alterations to the world we inhabit, or the world that is imagined proposed, and the conjectures that are necessary for that world to be so. Julie Rower many years ago proposed the term of speculist. This term was to describe the actions of such people as I have been describing, and as a result has brought under one heading the works of Feynman, Verne, Darwin, Dostoevsky, H.G. Wells, Einstein, and Shelley. It is in this tradition of the idea of wanting to see deeper and understand what the depth of the insight means that the works of the speculists are wrought. Julie is neither scientist nor writer. Rather, she is someone who looks to the horizon of what we believe to know and asks simply, what is beyond? Her meditations on these perspectives are what generate such artifacts as those contained within this volume. Bezoar Thirst. Okay, so Maeterlinck,
Yeah.
the influence, the purpose, the consequence,
Sure.
the organic architecture. Say.
Well, I'd like to bring up two things that are happening in organic engineering. Organic engineering. Now, for those of you who don't know what a MOF is, it is extremely relevant to our discussion on tonight's subject matter. A MOF, Metal Organic Framework.
Oh, I love these.
And
you've been
the
talking
Nobel
about
Prize
these
in Physics. I will read to you. So those of you who are unfamiliar with the MOF, it literally is going to change the world and for the better. This is an incredible and momentous discovery led by a phenomenal Japanese scientist, Dr. Susumu Kitagawa, who shared the 2025 Nobel Prize in Chemistry with two colleagues who were not at all in Japan, a Richard Robeson, I don't know of him, and an Omar M. Yagi. They all contributed in their own way, but the spearhead of that team and a man who started it many decades before they were involved, as far as I know. Just saw a long documentary on him on the great Japanese channel NHK World, which I watch a lot. Did a lot of my own research. And Dr. Susumu Kitagawa, who is a lovely and generous, kind man who actually does nurture skill and talent in science. And you have to credit him with having students and acolytes who love this man. I mean, he's really a kind person, which doesn't happen much in any discipline, especially science.
You know, I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
Okay. I find that often people who are not basically kind of jockeying for position, right? People who have attained a certain kind of status and
Mm-hmm.
have certain character usually are different than a lot of these kind of like people that we see on the back pages of Science magazine with their sexual, assaults and their kind of like misconducts and their kind of
There's an awful
things.
lot of that, sadly.
This certainly is. And in fact, I had a conversation this week with someone when they were talking about a specific scientist who I'm not going to mention, but
Yeah,
I
I
kind of
wouldn't.
talked
It's not
about the
a
fact
good
that,
idea.
you know, in the confines of the times where this existed, there was a tremendous amount of inequity in terms of the way in which powerful individuals conducted themselves in relationship to students,
Mm-hmm.
and there were tremendous amount of injustices and
Mm-hmm.
kind of like inequities that existed and that were exploited,
Okay.
and that was something that I think we still see and still have to contend with. But I find that what I've seen is, for the most part, this takes place below the top 5%.
Okay. I just want to
Yeah, go ahead.
continue,
Mm-hmm.
if I may. I'm losing my train of thought here.
Mm-hmm.
So, metal organic frameworks, MOFs or MOFs, are revolutionary porous materials built from metal nodes and organic linkers. And there are many types of organic linkers, from what I understand, many thousands of types,
Mm-hmm.
which create huge internal spaces, which have applications like carbon capture, meaning these tiny things can be set up with almost no setup time in the desert, and they will harvest water out of the clear dry sky.
Hmm.
Drinkable, usable, potable water.
Hmm.
They're revolutionary. And so they also capture carbon, they harvest water from air, hydrogen storage, drug delivery. Now, they always tack on drug delivery. To me, finding ways to give people more drugs and deliver more drugs is not a great use of science. There are so many more important things in getting everyone hooked on drugs with all of its side effects and dependencies.
Oh,
But let me
go ahead.
just say, so what these materials do, and which they really haven't said, is they have vast storage capacities. And what they store is incredible. They store gases, metal organic frameworks, which are lattice structures, store gases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. No, I think what's
Yeah.
interesting is that, like, as I've said before, I think that seeing the stories that are kind of emerging in science. I mean, having been, kind of like uh, looking over science and kind of reading science and nature for decades, we've seen so many things emerge. I mean, I remember when we first started to hear of the gut microbiome, when we started to hear of like MOFs, we started to hear of so many things, and these were just words that maybe a few scientists would speak about. But then eventually, like protein folding was another one, and
There
then
we go.
ultimately crystallization. We kind of come and see how
Pretty
these things,
great.
yeah,
This
pretty
is how they're
amazing.
going to understand it. And that is a working model of an MOF. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So anyway, I mean, so the point is that, like, we have come to see these stories just as the kind of great stories that were kind of given to us in kind of previous times in things like the Bible or the Greek myths and things like that.
Mhm.
So I think, as I said, Julie's engagement is this is kind of following in a great literary tradition, and I think, if one talks about psychology, one has to engage when one has to talk about Dostoevsky. If one wants to talk about, you know, if one's talked about other things, they kind of look at other, great writers as well. I think the case of Maeterlinck is the one we want to focus on in terms of the nature of organic architecture.
Sure.
So in this case, I mean, the observations, of artistic naturalism were in fact a kind of mechanism that gave rise to kind of certain kind of potentials for the scientific revolution. But I think in this case, the writer kind of brings us to understand certain mechanisms within the way in which these animals or these organisms existed. Both of us, Julie and I, were given the opportunity to speak at the Museum of Natural History, and we kind of were engaged with these themes. So anyway, as far as Maeterlinck is for you, a person who kind of can articulate this idea of kind of like being a speculist, how would you pertain that to the things that you understand, or how did you come to understand that within his work?
Understand which aspect of that? It's a very broad question.
No, but I'm saying like the reality is, as you know, as Ortega warns, the idea is that at a certain point, that ability to kind of lose the sense of judgment in the overall pattern is something to kind of be somewhat concerned with. And that in the case of Maeterlinck, I don't think he doesn't think of these things without seeing the general overall need to make sound judgments from a broad application.
Mm-hmm.
So when we started to read Maeterlinck, what were the things that when we read the Life of the Bee, right? What were the things that first were most kind of like shocking or kind of like stunning to you in terms of the kind of significance of what you saw within the work?
Well, in Maeterlinck's prose, I would liken it to an MOF, which is why I brought them up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did have a reason, which is that the very structure of the way Maeterlinck writes is very overlooked. He was a brilliant writer in many ways, and there were those who dismissed his writing as fanciful or flowery or too colorful for serious science writing. I think it's precisely the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the idea is Maeterlinck got in a very serious and very dedicated way at the subjects and the concepts he was talking about with far more depth and profundity, precisely because I would say he structured his work like an MOF, which I will explain. I mean, he didn't know about them,
right?
But the structure for me is very analogous for the following reason. May I say, or did you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that MOFs are incredibly rigorous. And in fact, they have very ephemeral capabilities. So you have a rigorous architectural structure that is engineered by humans, which is very much organic engineering. They are the epitome and the poster child of highly successful, incredibly inventive. They are very, very imaginative. And I would say this is the most imaginative Nobel Prize given in a long, long time. The holes in the MOFs, they are caverns, they're vast spaces in a tiny, tiny space. It's the caverns and the spaces that hold the adventures and the delights, and that in fact hold the true transformative information, just like in the way Maeterlinck writes. And I'll bring up, if I may, or did you want to comment? Field Flowers, which is one of my favorite Maeterlinck science essays, a plant science essay, a botany piece in the Double Garden. And this very opening is an MOF in literary terms. They welcome our steps without the city gates on a gay and eager carpet of many colors, which they wave madly in the sunlight. Right there, you have an unyielding, man-made metal gate, which is the metaphor of, it is the wall of a civilization. And you can see through the wall. It's not an opaque wall. It's not a brick wall. You have cavernous spaces. In fact, a metal gate is more space than metal. You always see past a metal gate It's not a wall. You see right through it. And there, in these enormous gaps and spaces, is the organic world that Maeterlinck beckons us to. And this organic world has a language, a lexicon, a civilization, and a complexity which humans have never ascribed to it. That's what I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think one of the things that I took from it in that case was I felt that, one of the things that's always happened is, for instance, architecture, I feel, exists in this kind of hermetic environment, kind of, and tries to kind of separate itself and kind of keep itself in this artificial entanglement with its own ego or fetish. And I think one of the things that I found by reading these pages, especially in The Life of the White Ant, was the kind of sense of incredulity of the kind of superiority of the organic, socially organic species aside from us. So I remember kind of starting my lecture at the Museum of Natural History by saying that, I was going to speak about architecture, and I was going to speak about the great architects, and I was going to say that, humans are some of the greatest architects that the planet has seen. And it was somewhat confusing, and it was kind of rustling, and then where it was, I was like, what do you mean, like non-human architects? And I kind of started to think about, like, what are you saying? I said, well, humans are very talented and have kind of come a long way in terms of like their engineering. But I think that we have to kind of say that, they're certainly not the best. And then the question was like, well, who's the best? And I kind of gave some examples, which was basically just the script was taken out of the books that I had read of Maeterlinck, and I just kind of gave some examples and added some of my own. And one of the ones I remember is like we had been going to the New York Botanical Gardens a lot, and Julie had found this incredible remains of a paper wasp nest, which she managed to kind of like find and capture and bring back, and now is in one of our cabinets of curiosities. But the thing that was amazing was that this paper wasp nest, after it had been ruined because someone had bashed it with a stick, had fallen from 10 times its own height to the ground, and in the process was still relatively intact, even after being weakened by it being battered. And I remember kind of saying this as a kind of indication that one of the things that was so impressive to me was, if you think about a paper wasp nest, the hive itself, the nest, weighs less than the inhabitants. And I said, think about that in terms of your house or your office or wherever you might go. I mean, think about the fact that even in the case of a bridge at full kind of like, under full load, that may be a little bit closer to that case. But I mean, my house, this building that I live in, with Julie, the inhabitants weigh a mere fraction of the overall weight of the building. And you take that into kind of say an office building or other things. I mean, comparing it to the fact that it would even be a one-to-one relationship, but the fact that the paper wasps were capable of, the wasp weighed more than the city. Imagine if we had a city where the inhabitants weighed more than the city. And then the fact that if we took a conventional building, and I think we saw this at the collapse of the World Trade Center, is that it only takes the drop of a few centimeters to create enough force to crush anything beneath it. So if we took, say, your average house, and if we were able to lift it off its footings without destroying it, and we dropped it from once its own height, it would basically be sawdust and splinters. And then I went through other of these, and I started to see the room kind of feel somewhat kind of sallow and kind of angry and kind of like sad. And I said, look, the advantage of these organisms that they've been around for hundreds of millions of years as opposed to us. So we have a lot of catching up to do, but we can't really feel terrible because we've come a long way in the time that we had. So given that, I kind of feel as if this possibility, this potential for the understanding of this organic architecture, which is how in which these individuals, and I'll call them individuals, operate within their own circumstance. The pages of Maeterlinck, I'm not going to, for people who have not read this work, I'm not going to sully it or kind of like destroy it by telling you, because, you really need to you need to listen to the way in which they fall out of his mouth, and the way he kind of structures them on the page to see their actual beauty. And I'm not going to sully that, but I think it's definitely something that you will kind of understand. We're talking abstractly about the consequence of Maeterlinck, but I really believe that the beauty is in his words.
Yeah.
So following up on that, what would you say is that which is, in terms of the speculist mentality, how would you say that there's a benefit? You've often talked about the fact that scientists are incredibly poor writers. And I think in this case, we're looking at a person who has given, tremendous insight into this concept of what I saw, which was the kind of like incapacity of humans in relation to the engineering and architecture of their, of social insects. So for you, what do you see in that realm?
What aspect? It's a very large realm.
Well, I mean, give any specifics, give any sense. I mean, like, you've talked, like I said, you talked about the fact that, scientists are incredibly poor writers.
Yeah.
So, I mean, give me a specific, because I mean, here we have an eloquent writer who kind of gets to a deep, thoughtful subject.
Mm-hmm.
And just off the top of your head, I mean, he uses, descriptions, he uses really beautiful images and metaphors. What would you say is, I mean, what do you find scientists lack in general in terms of their ability to kind of demonstrate concepts that kind of hold them back?
I'm happy to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. That was the plan.
Yeah, well, I read a lot of articles in the journals Science and sometimes Nature as well every week. And the articles are not only extremely dry, they are written in a way that even other scientists in tangential fields are not going to understand what is being said or communicated. Not because they're not intelligent, but it's written so badly. It's written to simply get it down, but they don't express their ideas well. I would say that when scientists write, they have a fear of putting anything down that might be construed as literary or whimsical, or it is in fact so unreadable most of the time. What would actually make it relevant and potent is the injection of analogies, the active use of the metaphor, which never ever exists in any articles I've ever read in the science journals. Now, one could argue incorrectly, I think, that these scientists are writing for clarity, but they're not achieving clarity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, they are supposedly writing for clarity, but to write in a very robotic, very dry way. And in fact, in many cases, they are using artificial intelligence now to write their papers. And instead of an editor, there's artificial intelligence reading and editing their papers. And there is never the interplay of analogy or metaphor, or really even simile, which is a fairly simplistic literary device. Mm-hmm. The idea is that metaphor and analogy are not only enhancements to understanding, they're pivotal springboards to understanding. And nothing sticks in the mind unless the mind reading most of the science articles is creating its own metaphors, which I do, because that enables me to carry these scientific concepts into my drawings, into my paintings, and out of the tiny little shoebox that they are writing in.
Yeah, I think what we'll do in the future is we'll have a program called specialist versus speculist. Mm. And I think that would be a kind of a good way to kind of take this aspect of that. But I think one of the things that kind of like is kind of like capable of being displayed is the fact that the individual who investigates, right, may become so specialized that they don't have the ability to cross into the why. There's a certain sense of domain, which actually makes a lot of sense in terms of the metal organic framework as a metaphor here, because the domain, the manifold, basically sets up the activities. They all become intertwined in terms of this structure that's basically organizing activity, somewhat like an architecture. So the metal organic framework basically is that mechanism that animates this process, these kind of
Yeah.
activities.
I'd like to read that when
Yeah.
you're done.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what people don't understand, and I will explain, is MMOFs are wondrous. They exist in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and 4 dimensions. They are incredible architectural marvels. So, just reading quickly, just for the sake of people understanding this. So, a metal organic framework is a porous extended structure made from metal ions and organic linkers. So this is an extended structure, is an architecture, these are my words too, whose subunits occur in a constant ratio and are arranged and rearranged in ever repeating patterns. They're a subclass of coordination network. So they are in fact an engineered network of intelligence. And these, then, in 1 dimension, they have cross links between 2 or more loops, chains, spiral links. And this is a compound extending and repeating in 2 or 3 or more, which this doesn't get into, dimensions. So when you talk about something extending and repeating in multiple dimensions, there are also amorphous versions of these.
Mm-hmm.
And these are almost frozen architectures in disordered phases that were not thought functional and have not only proved functional, they've proved incredibly functional. That's what I want to get across. And the language of Maeterlinck is full of adjectives, and this is what I want to get into. In a science article, one doesn't expect poetry and one does not expect fiction, but there's such an incredible fear of adjectives and adverbs and modifying words that you actually can't get at the meaning well reading sentences and phrases shorn of description. There's a reason why descriptive verbiage is important, and it is almost absent entirely from what is called scientific writing. It is so present in Maeterlinck. Would you like to say something, or should I read this?
No, go ahead.
So this is a very good example. But soon this light ventures forth into space. The nuptial thoughts of the earth become clearer and purer. The rough attempts disappear. The half dreams of the night lift like a fog, dispelled by the dawn, and the good rustic flowers begin their unseen revels under the blue all around the cities where man knows them not. No matter, they are there making honey, while their proud and barren sisters, who alone receive our care, are still trembling in the depths of the hothouses.
What I find brilliant about that is what he does, similar to what great artists have done with the kind of like with the great stories of the past, is he creates what I would call a speculative intention. Now, in this time, like what, 1905, 1910, right?
This is from 1904.
Okay, 1904. The idea of consciousness within organisms outside of humans was completely not even speculated upon.
But he did.
But in fact, here it is. So in fact, he comes forth with a scientific speculation, which turns out to be the case decades before it's even
And
imagined.
he was totally alone in his speculations.
Right. But the thing is, again, no one looks at a writer in
Mm.
terms of the speculation, in terms of the potential of the scientific investigation.
Mm.
But we see it.
Mm-hmm.
We see the fact that way in which he says these speculations. Now, the thing is, science, right now is battling with the idea of what and where is consciousness, to what degree, and to how deep into the strata of organism. Do viruses have conscious? I mean, for a long time, there's been a debate of, are viruses living organisms? Are they alive or are they not? This is a great question. All right. Is mathematics invented or is it discovered? It's a great question. But the question is, how deep does consciousness, right, render itself in terms of the scale of organism? It's a beautiful question, but here it is. It's something that we didn't really think deeply about, but here we are now starting to kind of cut the surface of this, and we're starting to realize, one of the things that we know now is that consciousness is not simply limited to humans. But this is an example of that speculation as a metaphor in works from 1904.
Yeah.
So again, what happens is this specialization is actually stunting us. And in fact, one of the things that concerns me about what Julie said before about AI is the same kind of like inertial language that we see in scientific writing will be compounded as it becomes AI'd. So that the algorithms will basically kind of compound that kind of like that defect. So we'll start to see that same lack of adjectives, that same lack of adverbs become compounded because of the fact that the AI generator will kind of see these patterns and simply just continue to duplicate them and compound the error and further kind of, distort this picture.
Yeah.
So I think that, in order to release the nature of the deepening of the understanding, we need to understand that which Julie understood a long time ago, which is that we're all engaged in this investigation to deepening our understanding of the natural world and of the universe. And, to see that become the domain of science and not understand that it is basically the essence of art, is a foolish kind of like mistake. So I would say that in terms of engaging in this work, I would say Maeterlinck, the Double Garden, is a place where he talks about these speculations on the natural world in terms of our friend the dog,
Yeah.
right? And he talks about flowers. He talks about the way in which certain things kind of come and other things remove them.
Mm-hmm.
There's one where he talks about old flowers, right?
Old-fashioned
flowers, because he's talking about the way in which one group is basically is being removed as it's being replaced by the new flowers that are coming to take their place in this particular terrain, which again talks about the idea of migrations, right? Which again is a study that we're now still realizing is an incredibly potent and visceral kind of place. So you're kind of going to,
yeah. I had several things marked. But...
Well, good. I mean, because I look at it like these things are things that for me, I kind of found this. And it's funny because, there's certain people who kind of exist in strange places. We realized ourselves this week, we live in a very strange place because we've kind of like understood that though we're trained in certain fields. I mean, I'm trained as an architect. Julie's trained as a graphic artist, right?
Graphic
designer, not even a painter or writer, but you've been a painter and writer all your life, and I've been an architect all my life.
To do.
But exactly. But I find that what we've done because of this venture that we're on, we've kind of found ourselves in a way where we're kind of somewhat alienated from other people, many other people who kind of find what we do to just be odd, which
Yeah, I think that's a nice word.
we've been called some names.
Yeah, well, the thing that's very key here is Maeterlinck taps into the profound sense of alienation that he clearly felt, and that he, I should say, finds in nature. There is an alienation in those entities, human and non human, which are incredibly misunderstood, misinterpreted, and harangued by people and forces who don't understand them.
Are you going to read this?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can't wait.
Okay. This is from Old Fashioned Flowers, 1904, page 255. That is why I love above all the simplest, the commonest, the oldest, and the most antiquated, those which have a long human past behind them, a large array of kind and consoling actions, those which have lived with us for hundreds of years and which form part of ourselves, since they reflect something of their grace and their joy of life in the soul of our ancestors. But where do they hide themselves? They are becoming rarer than those which we call rare flowers of today. Their life is secret and precarious. It seems as though we were on the point of losing them, and perhaps there are some which, discouraged at last, have lately disappeared, of which the seeds have died under the ruins, which will no more know the dew of the gardens, and which we shall find only in very old books, among the bright grass of the illuminators, or along the yellow flower beds of the primitives.
Again, it talks about this profound sense of migratory circumstance, the fact that certain things advance, other things recede, and the knowledge of those things is something that we sometimes take for granted. I find that these things also make sense when I think of, the idea that these are networks and scales of circumstance. Having a conversation tonight after leaving the Met, we were speaking about the idea that at a certain point, certain things exist at multiple scales and multiple layers, like the MOF. The MOF is basically a kind of like multidisciplinary, kind of like layered circumstance at multiple different levels, and it kind of like allows and engages all these things simultaneously. So like the gate that kind of you see the flowers through, it actually becomes the membrane from which this reality takes place. The process actually engages inside the MOF. And the MOF, basically, it could be a portal, it can be a gate, it can be a wall, it can be a fence, it can be a thing in itself, because it doesn't exist in isolation, but it exists in relationship to other things.
MOFs have been compared, and I compared them that way, and a few other people did, to snowflakes, each with an individual fingerprint, footprint, and structure. So these inorganic and organic architectures, which are engineered, are very, very comparable to snowflakes, which are not. And the comparison is backed up here, that both MOFs and snowflakes exhibit intricate, often hexagonal crystalline patterns. Now, this is going on about how they differ in origin, yes, but that is kind of the point, is to search out and find provable analogies and structures in things of vastly different origin.
Right. And in fact, if I was a scientist in the real sense of what a scientist is. I would basically look across circumstances to see these repeating patterns. I think that one of the things that happens is we're aware of the fact that there are repeating patterns within disciplines. But I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is nobody has the foresight or the insight or the capability, which I think is an indictment of the scientific enterprise, and why I use the term technical service workers, which is similar to what Ortega talked about, is that no one has the understanding to look across, right, and see the fact that these broad patterns and structures overlap, right, and are definitely not simply within the engagement of the simple specialization in which someone might find this or that. I mean, I kind of use an analogy of the fact that wings, for some reason, keep kind of popping up as things similar to fins and similar to other kind of things that exist in terms of morphology and typology. But we also see these things and in different scales in different organisms.
Yeah.
So
the key takeaway word here is hierarchical growth and self-assembly. Both MOFs can self-assemble, grow exponentially, hierarchically. Both MOFs are very, very porous. And one thing that they do above everything else is vast storage capacity. These tiny, tiny metal organic frameworks have the capacity proven, which was what one of the main things that the 2025 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was for, to store vast quantities of gases, meaning they are storing things that have very different material properties from themselves. So a self-assembling engineered architecture can store alien compounds, which is what the gases are. They're not gaseous at all, but they can store them and release them in their usable original forms without compromising their chemical integrity. That is incredible.
That is incredible. In fact, when Tom was driving us home last night, we passed.
Yeah, hi,
speaking of gas and the kind of expulsion of gas, there's a new Indian place, a new curry place.
That's funny.
Yeah. Actually, let me apologize. I mean, we were very excited about this particular episode, and I apologize that the kind of like we became maybe a little bit overly serious this evening, rather than kind of like go with the kind of like frivolous, kind of enjoyable kind of nature. And I don't know what bogged us down, but I think maybe it was the material was such that it kind of became something where seriousness had a desire. And again, these are serious topics, but I mean, the whole idea is that we want to also engage in the fact that I don't want anyone to be overwhelmed or anyone to be scared off. I want to make sure that people feel comfortable in the fact that these things are there, not just to be kind of overly inertially burdened with, but in terms of being kind of beautiful things to engage with and something that one can basically see the beauty of. In fact, there was a conversation I had this evening with someone who's now a new new Instagram friend, in the fact that because of something they saw in my drawing, they realized there was a lot of potential in the objects in the case that I was investigating. And for me, that idea that maybe in a way I've made myself, as a result of my investigations, capable of kind of being fortunate that I can find this intricacy and this beauty in things that other people would kind of look at as kind of like mundane or boring or kind of unworthy. But I kind of find this theme kind of coming up in conversations. And though it encourages me to feel fortunate that I've been able to get to this level of my investigations, I feel sad that I can't, that other people don't see this in the beauty in which I can engage in that. And that kind of, so it was a nice thing to have it recognized in my ability, but it made me sad that it isn't a common thing that people are capable of having, because I know for themselves, because I know how much pleasure and satisfaction I get out of it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. God bless us all, everyone. Merry
Mhm.
Christmas. So, so we're coming up on, a couple of minutes here. Do you want to give us any kind of final thoughts or kind of wrap up in terms of where you think we're headed?
Yeah, I'll surprise you and give you a whole new line of thought.
Oh, you.
Yeah, it's the subject of my newest drawing that for various reasons I didn't get much of a start on today. I won't say any more about that. But I will say that the subject is fascinating and I plan to do it justice next Friday. The subject is, for those who don't know what this is, it is a compound eye in Drosophila melanogaster, or the common fruit fly. And if you see all these units, these are called ommatidia. These are subunits. They're all hexagonal. They're all on a lattice. And they did not know how and this is the eye on a giant Drosophila face. Looks like something out of a great 50s
You might be
film.
upset if we call them common.
Yeah, well, they're not.
They're not.
But anyway, it turns out that these are how these subunits of ommatidia are really formed. And the surprising answer, and as I've said, and I'll say it now because I've never said it here, what spurs me on in my study of the biological sciences is the mystery of it. Arthur Conan Doyle loved a mystery. I love Arthur Conan Doyle, and I too love a mystery and the true Sherlock Holmes, which is when you think you understand why something happened, you aren't doubting that it happened, but what happens when you find an entirely new set of foundational reasons for these happenings, and no one saw them coming. The answer here, calcium waves. Pretty random calcium waves keep these it's about 750 ocular subunits in the typical eye of the Drosophila melanogaster. What keeps them all forming perfect hexagons is calcium, actually. And the calcium waves also maintain the integrity and structure of the lattice grid across the entire Drosophila eye. So these are the units which look incredibly much like MOFs too. And that's what I want to say. You can have your last time here.
Oh. God bless us all, everyone. Yeah. Anyway, so I think that this was a start. I think that there's a lot more to kind of talk about here, because I think what I found is in the last couple of days, a lot of other observations have come in to kind of feel as if there's a kind of coalescence around this particular topic with the things that we've been talking about over several weeks. So in terms of the fact that we're kind of like, we'll see if we return to this. So drawing as a generator is next week's topic, and it'll be the last topic for the year. And it'll basically be related to process. So we've talked about drawing, but drawing as a generator is kind of basically pertaining to the idea of it is the place from which speculations can originate, rather than just simply being a device to illustrate an existing idea. So it is basically an investigator itself. That's one of the things that we'll kind of be talking about as we kind of roll over. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's the benefit of all for us to keep it this way.
Merry Christmas.